A huge severe threat is coming, but there's a twist to this one that's going to make forecasting it a lot trickier than usual. We've got an active pattern setting up across a big chunk of the country over the next 7 days, with multiple rounds of severe weather capable of producing damaging winds, large hail, and tornadoes. But instead of this just being a straightforward system that marches across the country in a predictable way, are going to keep meteorologists like me on our toes, and honestly, might catch a few people off guard if they're not paying attention to the details. So let's get right into the forecast because there's a lot to break down here. Let's start with today, and today is really where this whole stretch kicks off. We've got a level 2 risk of severe weather in place across parts of the mid-Mississippi Valley, including areas like Springfield, Missouri, and stretching down toward Memphis. And this is where we're watching for an elevated tornado threat this afternoon and evening. We've also got a slight risk extending into the high plains and a couple of marginal threats, one across the northeast and another stretching from the mid-Atlantic back toward Oklahoma City and Denver. So basically, all hazards of severe weather are going to be on the table somewhere in the country today. And the main concern across most of these zones is going to be damaging wind gusts along with some isolated large hail. Now here's where the twist starts to show up, because normally on a setup like this, you'd expect the tornado threat to be pretty straightforward, concentrated right where the best instability and shear overlap. But today, we've actually got 2 separate corridors to watch, and they're behaving very differently from each other. Up in Montana, just north of Billings, there's a small chance of an isolated brief tornado, but the bigger story is back down near that Springfield, Missouri through western Kentucky corridor, where a few tornadoes are possible this afternoon and evening. The twist here is that there's a lot of cloud cover and morning convection moving through this region right now, and that's actually working against the tornado threat by stabilizing the atmosphere somewhat. But if that convection doesn't hang around as long as currently forecast, it could open the door for a stronger tornado threat than what's currently advertised. So this is one of those days where the forecast could shift higher with very little notice. And if you live near Evansville or Louisville, you're sitting right in the bullseye of whichever way this trend breaks. Moving into tomorrow, the severe weather threat gets significantly larger in terms of geographic coverage, and this is where things really start to connect together into one sprawling system. We've got a slight risk now stretching across the far northern plains, covering North Dakota, Montana, and South Dakota, and a separate slight risk running along the Virginia and North Carolina coastline. In between those 2 areas, we've got a marginal threat that covers an enormous footprint, basically linking St. Louis and Kansas City back over toward Charlotte and up into Rapid City. All hazards are going to be possible tomorrow. But I want to focus on 2 specific areas because this is where the twist in this pattern becomes most apparent. Up near Bismarck, we're expecting a line of thunderstorms to develop later in the afternoon into the evening, and this could produce some significant damaging winds along with large to very large hail. The tornado threat up here is actually a little bit lower than I'd expect given how strong our wind shear values are looking, and that's honestly a bit surprising to me. But then, completely separately, down near Springfield, Missouri, there's a chance for a couple of rogue supercells to develop, and if they do, we could be looking at a stronger tornado threat than what's currently outlined for that specific area. This is highly conditional, meaning it depends heavily on whether storms can actually initiate and stay discrete, rather than clustering together. But it's a real enough possibility that if you live anywhere in the Ozarks, you need to be paying attention tomorrow afternoon and evening, rather than assuming the bigger story is happening somewhere else. As we move into the weekend, the threat shifts its center of gravity up into the northern plains and the upper Midwest, and this is where the overall pattern really starts to lock in. On Saturday, we're watching Wisconsin, the upper Midwest, and back into the Dakotas, with the primary concern being damaging wind gusts and very large hail. I wouldn't completely rule out a couple of tornadoes in this corridor, but right now the tornado threat looks a bit lower compared to some of the other days in this stretch, which honestly is one of the more interesting parts of this whole forecast, because the ingredients up here are actually quite favorable on paper. That brings me to the twist I really want to spend some time on, because it explains a lot about why this entire weekend and early next week forecast carries more uncertainty than usual. Our low pressure system, which is really the engine driving all of this severe weather, is currently positioned up in Alberta and Saskatchewan, well north of the border. With it sitting up there, it's going to struggle a bit to produce the kind of widespread, organized severe weather outbreak you'd normally expect from a system this strong, simply because the surface features needed to. Trigger storms aren't going to be perfectly positioned underneath the best upper level support. The best chance for significant severe weather is going to be closest to that low, meaning North Dakota, South Dakota, Montana, and possibly into Minnesota by Sunday. On Sunday specifically, that threat should shift a bit further east, with our low-level J T cranking hard from around Minneapolis up toward International Falls. That's going to create a more localized pocket where significant severe weather becomes more likely, assuming storms can actually get going. And that's the twist for Sunday, too. There's real uncertainty about whether storms will even form in this environment, despite how volatile the atmosphere looks on paper. We could see this entire setup underperform if there isn't enough of a trigger to get storms initiated, or we could see it way overperform if just one or two cells manage to take advantage of the instability and shear that's in place. This is what we call a cap bust risk, where the atmosphere is loaded with energy, but a layer of warm air aloft prevents storms from actually breaking through it. And when that cap does break, you can get an explosive, almost instantaneous transition from nothing happening to significant severe weather happening very quickly. Monday looks like it could be another big day, especially across the upper Midwest and back. Into the Central Plains, as that low pressure system gradually begins sliding eastward. The Storm Prediction Center already has a slight risk posted for Monday, and given how things are trending, I wouldn't be surprised if that gets upgraded as we get closer. By Tuesday, things get murkier again, because we're going to be sitting underneath what's called a ring, a fire pattern across the mid-Mississippi Valley. This happens when a dome of high pressure sets up to the south, and that forces disturbances to ride around its northern and western edge, creating repeated rounds of thunderstorms, sometimes as organized lines, sometimes as discrete supercells, depending on exactly how much moisture gets funneled up into the flow. There's a lot of uncertainty in exactly how this plays out, but the overall pattern favors continued thunderstorm activity moving through the Midwest into Wednesday as well. So let's go through the day-by-day timing in a bit more detail, starting with what's happening today specifically. This morning, we've got a cluster of thunderstorms moving toward Nashville and central Kentucky, and that could produce some isolated damaging wind gusts right out of the gate. But the bigger concern is going to develop through the afternoon, as our warm sector really opens us up and allows for some rotating supercells to take shape. By 3 to 4 o'clock, storms should be ongoing to the south and west of St. Louis, capable of producing isolated hail, damaging winds, and possibly an isolated tornado. The area I'm watching most closely is near Evansville, where our significant tornado parameter values are sitting in a range that isn't extremely high, but is enough that any storm able to take full advantage of the environment could spin up a tornado. The latest high-resolution model guidance shows maybe 1 or 2 storms trying to rotate near Evansville specifically, and we'll also have additional storms developing near St. Louis, Farmington, and down through Poplar Bluff and Cape Girardeau, all capable of producing isolated tornadoes along with the wind and hail threat. Once we move into the overnight hours tonight, most of the severe weather concerns should taper off, with the lingering risk shifting more toward flash flooding as storms slow down and dump heavier rainfall in a shorter window. I think the peak window for tornado potential today runs roughly from 2:30 this afternoon through about 7:30 or 8 tonight. So if you're in that corridor, that's your window to be most weather aware. Out across the Central Plains, we could see a few storms develop this evening as well, and if you're near Tulsa, don't be caught off guard by a hail or wind threat, even though the tornado risk there should stay on the lower end. As we shift into tomorrow's timing, I want to go from east to west, since the eastern side of this threat fires up earliest. Over in the Ohio Valley, we'll be watching a scattered area of thunderstorms during the day, fairly typical for this time of year, with damaging wind gusts and some isolated large hail being the main concerns near Nashville, Cape Girardeau, and Chattanooga. I'm not expecting much of a tornado threat in this specific zone, but I do want to flag something important. These storms are going to be training over similar areas throughout the day, meaning one storm after another moving over roughly the same track, and that significantly raises the risk of localized flash flooding. If you've got travel plans through this corridor tomorrow, build in some extra time and watch for water on roadways. Along the East Coast tomorrow, we'll have thunderstorms developing near Richmond and Raleigh, capable of producing isolated downburst winds and hail up to around half-dollar size. And then back over near Springfield, this is where that non-zero chance for an isolated supercell comes back into play. If one of these cells does manage to form and stay discrete, it would be working with a genuinely favorable tornado environment in that specific pocket. So it's worth keeping an eye on, even though the overall probability of it actually happening remains low rather than zero. But the real story for tomorrow, and the piece of this forecast that has me most attentive, is what happens farther north. Up across Nebraska and into North Dakota, our wind shear values are significant, with the kind of orange and red shading on our significant tornado parameter maps that typically corresponds to environments capable of supporting EF3 or stronger tornadoes. The twist here is that I'm honestly not certain storms are even going to fire in this environment at all. Our high-resolution model guidance has storms beginning to develop as early as 3 to 4 in the afternoon over in Montana, and the big question becomes whether that activity can spread into Nebraska and North Dakota, where the most dangerous setup actually exists. If storms do manage to get going in those specific zones, we'd be looking at a real possibility of a higher-end tornado outbreak, with multiple supercells capable of producing strong, long-track tornadoes. The fact that some of our model guidance is showing exactly that scenario, multiple supercells forming in Nebraska and North Dakota simultaneously, is honestly a little concerning to me. And I think the official tornado risk percentages might end up needing to be raised as we get closer to game time tomorrow. This activity should continue into the evening and even overnight hours as it tracks up into Saskatchewan and Manitoba. So if you live anywhere in the central or northern plains, tomorrow deserves your full attention rather than a quick glance at the morning forecast. Sunday, that same general threat continues across the northern plains and upper Midwest, with the potential for several more supercells, some strong tornadoes, damaging winds, and very large hail all back on the table. But again, this comes with the same uncertainty I mentioned earlier about whether storms actually initiate. It's entirely possible this setup underdelivers if the atmospheric cap doesn't break, or it's entirely possible it dramatically overdelivers if just the right trigger comes along. That's the nature of this particular stretch of weather, and it's exactly the kind of forecast where you want to stay tuned rather than assume you already know how it plays out. Looking further ahead, Monday continues shifting the threat eastward across a broad area from Nebraska and Colorado back into northern Minnesota, with all hazards in play once again. Tuesday brings more uncertainty as model guidance disagrees on exactly how far north that low-pressure system sits, but a line of thunderstorms remains a real possibility across the Midwest. And as we look toward Wednesday and Thursday, that ring of fire pattern looks like it's going to keep producing rounds of thunderstorms across the northern plains and Midwest through the middle of next week. As for the 4th of July itself, it's still early, but current model guidance is hinting at a fairly stormy setup across the northern plains, with the rest of the country looking more variable and the west coast looking quiet by comparison. That's subject to change quite a bit between now and then, so don't lock in any final plans just yet, but it's worth having on your radar. So here's the bottom line on this whole stretch. We've got an extended period of active severe weather ahead of us, but instead of a clean, predictable system moving through, we've got genuine uncertainty about exactly where and whether storms initiate on several of these days, environments that look more dangerous on paper than they may end up producing, and a few corridors where the forecast could shift significantly with very little advance notice. That's the twist in this one. Stay weather aware, keep multiple ways to receive warnings, and we'll keep refining these details as we get closer. Thanks so much for watching, and we'll see you in the next forecast.